Hello. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by the Conference Board. My name is Jennifer Tarlow. I'm the Senior Vice President of Human Resources at the Conference Board. Today, I'll be sitting down with author Art Markman to discuss his latest book, Bring Your Brain to Work, Using Cognitive Science to Get a Job, Do It Well, and Advance Your Career. Dr. Art Markman is the Annabel, Irion, Worsham Centennial Professor of Psychology and Marketing at the University of Texas at Austin and director of the IC2 Institute. Art previously served as the founding director of the Human Dimensions of Organizations programs. He has written over 150 scholarly papers on topics including reasoning, decision-making, and motivation. Art brings insights from cognitive science to a broader audience through his blogs at Psychology Today and Fast Company, as well as his radio show, podcast, Two Guys on Your Head. In his latest book, Bring Your Brain to Work, published by Harvard Business Review Press, Art focuses on three essential elements of a successful career: getting a job, excelling at work, and finding your next position, and expertly illustrates how cognitive science, especially psychology, sheds fascinating and useful light on each of these elements. Welcome, Art, to today's program.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's great to be here.
So let's begin this conversation with the following question. In Bring Your Brain to Work, you reveal insights from cognitive science that can help people be more successful in their careers. What exactly is cognitive science?
So cognitive science is this interesting interdisciplinary mix of fields that are all aimed at trying to understand the mind. So it includes psychology, neuroscience, computer science, anthropology, sociology, education. And the idea behind it is that no single approach to doing research on the way the mind works is going to have a privileged way of telling us everything we need to know. And so instead, what we do is to bring together people with different kinds of expertise in the same way that businesses create multifunctional teams in order to solve difficult problems. And by creating that cross-fertilization of ideas in which people not only are exposed to that work, but are encouraged to collaborate together, we're able to get insights into the human mind that we wouldn't be able to get from any single discipline alone.
Great. Thank you for explaining that. Most people think of their career as a whole, but you say there are really three phases: getting the job, keeping the job, and moving up or moving on. Can you provide a little more insight into these areas and why we need to think about each of them differently?
So most of us, once we've gotten a job, are really focused primarily on doing that job, the elements that lead to success. And I certainly treat those in the center section of the book. Issues like how to be as productive as possible, how to communicate effectively, be a good leader, and issues like that. But early in your career, but also periodically throughout, you're also focused on this idea that you have to impress somebody in order to get another job. Now, sometimes the people you're impressing are recruiters and hiring managers from a firm you don't yet work for. Sometimes you're actually trying to impress people at the firm you do work for. But either way, there are a different set of activities that you engage in when you're angling for that next position. And so treating that separately makes a lot of sense because those activities often happen at particular punctuated parts of your career. And then there are also times where after you've been working for a while, you're trying to decide, am I really happy with what I'm doing? Am I unhappy because I really hate this career? Or am I unhappy or dissatisfied because I really want more responsibility or different responsibility? And so what I'm trying to do is to move up either within the organization that I work for now, or perhaps by jumping to a parallel organization and doing the next job at a competing firm.
That makes a lot of sense. You know, in the book, you discuss three mental systems: the motivational brain, the social brain, and the cognitive brain. What are they, and how do they function in each of the job phases in, our careers?
Sure. So let's start with that motivational brain. Motivation is the set of brain mechanisms that we have that drive us to act in certain ways. And that influences each of those parts of our careers. So, for example, when we're looking for a job, then a lot of times we're motivated to do things that feel particularly comfortable in that moment. So we often will gravitate towards things that fit with what we've encountered before, and yet often the best opportunities for us are things we haven't thought about for ourselves before. We need to allow ourselves to be surprised by what the world can offer. And so we have to recognize that our motivation may drive us back towards things that we've done in the past. In the case of managing that career while you're in the job, motivation is crucial for that ability to be productive. Think, for example, about procrastination. A lot of times we will avoid tasks that we think are going to be difficult for us. And so if you have to have a tough conversation with someone, you may put it off as long as possible. But in fact, if you have that conversation in a productive way, often you can take what could have been a really negative experience and actually turn it into a positive, both for you and for the other person, in ways that can actually allow you to move the organization forward. You may be able to find new opportunities out of what might have seemed like a bad situation. And so being willing to be motivated to take that on becomes really important. And of course, motivation plays a significant role in decisions to move on. One of the things that we know is that people are, generally speaking, not motivated to do very much when they're satisfied with where they are. And so one of the things we have to do, both in ourselves and in people who we're trying to help to develop their careers, is to create a little bit of dissatisfaction to help them to move forward in their career. So those are ways that the motivational brain plays out. The social brain is the set of mechanisms that allows us to interact with other people effectively. That's critical, again, in all three phases of the career. So when you are trying to get a job, one of the things you have to do is to put yourself in the mindset of recruiters and hiring managers, recognizing, for example, that when someone is at the first phase of evaluating a bunch of resumes, they're actually in a mindset of rejection. And so you have to actually make sure that you're not giving someone an easy reason to reject you. So, for example, leave Comic Sans off of the resume. But after you've gotten past that initial rejection, now you also need to create opportunities for someone to want to accept you, to actually bring you in. And so you have to help provide that reason for that recruiter to want you as the person that you're interviewing. When you're in the workplace itself, then that social brain plays a role at a variety of facets. For example, let's consider communication. We are optimized for having communication between small numbers of people face-to-face in real time. So our listeners are not face-to-face with us, and they're not in real time. They can't stop this recording and say, wait a second, clarify that for me. Now, you could do that because we're in this situation. And what that means is that we have to be paying attention when we communicate to the audience that we intend. I can't just say things you're going to understand. I have to be mindful of all the people who are going to be listening. And that's a general skill that we have to take on in communication, recognizing we have to become expert at understanding the people that we're communicating for, because so much of our communication these days, whether it's email and text or these kinds of podcasts or presentations we might give, are given to audiences who don't have that opportunity to interrupt us. And then that social brain also plays a role as we move on in our career, where we have to begin to think about things like, what will the impact be of our deciding perhaps to move away from the firm we're working for now and to go to a rival? There's a lot of movement in the workplace right now. People are jumping ship. It's not the case that we expect people to stay with a single firm for their whole careers. And in fact, there's now a term of art called the boomerang employee, in which someone leaves a firm and then comes back. And so it's so important as you navigate those transitions from one job to another that you don't burn those bridges, because you may very well end up working with those people again in the future. And there's a lot of social savvy that goes along with that. And of course, the third brain here, the cognitive brain, is the one that allows you to think and to reason and to make good decisions. And that also plays a big role at each of the phases of the career. So for example, one of the things that I talk about in terms of the interview process is that it's important to find ways to show what you can do rather than telling what you can do. One great example of that is people often say things like, I'm a real motivated person. I'm a real self-starter. Now, that's a great thing to say, but actually the best way to demonstrate that is to know as much as possible about the firm you're interviewing for. If you show up to that interview hyper prepared, you have demonstrated the kind of preparation you bring to work every day. You don't have to tell anybody because they can see it. That cognitive brain also plays a role in your day-to-day work, in particular because you should be prepared to learn on the job every day. Most people think that they have to be completely qualified for the job that they take when they take it. But in fact, as I said to one of my kids when he was applying for jobs for the first time, if you're completely prepared for the role that you take on, you aim too low. So one of the things you want to do is actually to be prepared to be learning all the time, taking on new responsibilities, and not to feel inadequate because of the things you don't know, but rather to take that as a challenge, to challenge yourself to learn all of the new knowledge and skills you need to excel in that new position. And then as you begin to think about moving on, one of the signs that you want to move on is that you've stagnated, is that you're not learning anymore, that you are making the same kinds of decisions over and over again. And that's the point at which you want to look to a role that will allow you to grow in a direction that you're excited about, because that actually brings together that cognitive brain with the motivational brain, where now you're learning new skills, but you're doing it in a way that actually excites you to move forward.
Really helpful examples that you just gave, particularly about the boomerang. That happens more today than I think people recognize. And I want to actually go back to a point you made earlier in this question, and you were talking actually about motivation as relates to happiness. Most research out there shows that your manager plays an enormous piece in an individual employee's happiness. Elaborate on what your research has actually shown related to that.
Yeah. So, the thing about happiness in the workplace is that happiness is an emotion that reflects the motivational brain. So actually, if you look at real brains, the motivational mechanisms are run through areas of the brain that are buried deep inside the human brain. They are actually brain structures very similar to ones you would see if you were to dissect a rat brain or a mouse brain or a deer brain. And consequently, those areas of the brain are not actually very well connected to the outer cortex of the brain, where we have our sophisticated reasoning apparatus, our ability to introspect on what we think. And so often we're not completely sure what's driving our behavior. The way we know how our motivational system is doing is actually through the emotions we experience. When things are going well motivationally, we feel good. When things are going poorly motivationally, we feel bad. And the more invested we are in that goal, the stronger that emotion. So what that means is that those emotions you experience are a reflection of the sum total of things that are happening in the workplace. Now, managers certainly do play some role in that because they can create environments in which they are constantly making you feel inadequate in the work you're doing in ways that make you dread going to work. And that's a situation in which people tend to disengage because negative emotions are painful. We don't actually like to experience them. But it's not the only factor that drives our happiness. So another big factor is actually the values that we have. So one of the things that each of us has is a set of values that we get partly from society around us, but partly through our own life experience. And those values actually change a little bit over the course of our lives, and they really do drive our happiness with work. So if you're the sort of person who values achievement, then if you're not able to display that you are moving forward, taking on positions of responsibility, that's also going to make you unhappy. Of course, managers can play a role in that, in opening up opportunities or not. But you also have to recognize that that's something important for you. But you also have to pay attention to shifts in your values over time. So, for example, some people early on feel like, yes, achievement's really important to me, and only later on begin to realize that actually they care much more about doing good for the people around them, that this value of benevolence matters a lot. And they may actually find that some of the victories that they've gotten in achievement are hollow victories because they feel like they've gotten them at the expense of actually being able to help others. And at that moment, they will shift the way that they do their job more in the direction of, can I find ways to actually be of service to the people around me? And so when you find yourself unhappy, you certainly want to look at, are there people in the workplace that are making me unhappy? But also ask yourself, is it because the things I'm asked to do day to day are not a particularly good fit to my underlying values?
Absolutely. That's terrific advice for people out there to hear. We're going to take a short break for some quick announcements and be back in just a minute to continue this fascinating conversation with Dr. Art Markman on his latest book, Bring Your Brain to Work.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello, and welcome back to our conversation with Dr. Art Markman on his latest book, Bring Your Brain to Work. Art, when we left off, we were discussing how cognitive function impacts our careers and job success. But how about the other end of the spectrum? Do you have any advice on understanding how the brain of a recruiter or hiring manager works? And how can we use this to our advantage when it comes to resume submission or interviewing process itself?
Yeah. So I mentioned a little bit earlier this idea that mindsets shift. And so that's certainly one thing to bear in mind, that recruiters will go from that mindset of rejection to the mindset of acceptance. And part of what happens there that I want to elaborate on is that often recruiters are looking for reasons why they should bring a particular candidate in, often because they have paperwork they need to fill out, and so they need to be able to give a reason. You should do as much as you can to give them that reason, to actually give them that text that they can put down on their paperwork for why it is that you are being brought in for that interview. So help make that recruiter's job a little bit easier. But the other thing that you want to recognize is that recruiters, either intentionally or unintentionally, are giving you a lot of information about firms that you are interviewing with in the process of engaging. They're telling you how they value your time. They're telling you, is this a firm that actually wants to train you in the process of your job? So if they ask you a question and you don't understand the question or you're not sure how to answer it, a lot of times you treat that as if I'm in an exam and you freeze up and you think, I don't know what to do now. But it's not an exam. It's actually a conversation. You can ask questions and you can even say, I'm really not sure how to address that. What would you suggest? And one of the things that does is to give you insight into whether they expect that everyone who comes into the workplace is going to be a fully formed, completely ready human being, or whether there are opportunities to actually learn. One of my favorite interviews in my life was when I was in college. I interviewed with a retail firm in which I was going to have to act as a salesperson on the floor. And the person who interviewed me asked me a whole series of questions about how I would handle sales situations, which I completely failed at because I'd never had any sales experience. And actually, the interviewer gave me a little mini lesson in how to sell. Some of those lessons I still remember to this day, and I got the job and actually think I did okay once I was there because the firm was actually committed to teaching people who didn't have a lot of sales experience how to be better at it. And so you're learning a lot about the firm in the process of that interview.
So when it comes to getting a job offer, what can we learn from cognitive science to make the most of the negotiating process?
So a lot of times when we negotiate, we have the wrong model of negotiation. We think to ourselves, negotiation is really about two people sitting across the table from each other, and the negotiated agreement is a point on that table somewhere. And then it becomes a tug of war, because the closer that gets to me, the further it gets from the other person. And so now I feel like we're in conflict. But there's an alternative, which is actually, if I'm going to go work for you, I'm working with you. And so in many ways, it's in your interests to make sure that the needs that I have are actually met. Otherwise, I'm going to be an unhappy employee from the beginning. And so fundamentally, when I'm negotiating with you, I should actually tell you what I need. I should be very clear with you. This is where I am in my life. These are the things that are most important to me. Certainly, if you can pay me more than I want, that would be great. But here are my basic needs, and here are the other things that I need, whether it's some flexibility in my schedule because I have a family, or whether it's training that I'd like to get because I have ambitions in my career. The more that I let you know what I need, the more that you can actually craft a job that will make us partners in ways that can allow us to work for the long term. So we shouldn't necessarily walk into negotiations as if this is an adversarial relationship. And yet, I think a lot of people do that.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And as with most things in life, experience does help the process.
Absolutely.
As you do it again and again. A lot of people are told to find a job they're really passionate about, but that might be a lot easier to do, or not to do, I should say. Can you explain why, and how do you know when it's time to change a job, or possibly even your entire career?
So let's start with this notion of passion. Actually, the advice I hate most is when people say, find your passion. In part because we often learn to love the job that we're in, even if we enter into something that we're not quite sure about. Because what often drives that joy with a career and that satisfaction is that feeling that we're part of something that's bigger than ourselves, that serves a bigger mission. And so even if the particular tasks that we do are not the ones that we necessarily envision doing, they can still add up to something very powerful in ways that can make us feel passionate for that job. And actually, sometimes you discover that things you thought you would hate, you learn to love. I was able to get a lot of stories from people over the course of writing this book. I just put things out on social media, and there were plenty of stories of people who went into jobs not thinking, oh, this particular task would be one that I would like, but ultimately found themselves deeply engaged because of the mission of the organization. However, there are times where you find that you don't really love what you're doing, and you've been doing it for a long time. And then one of the big things that I've noticed is that people often wait for some sort of personal tragedy before they really start to contemplate a big career change. That tragedy might be the death of a loved one, or an illness or accident for themselves. And one of the things that I've been trying to encourage people to do is not to wait for those tragedies to reevaluate where you are in your career, but instead to take that step back at least once a year on an important date. It could be the HR evaluation you're forced to do every year. It might be your birthday. It might be New Year's. It might be some other date that's special to you. But whatever it is, ask yourself, am I on a trajectory that's really going to lead me to feel good about my career? And there's two things I want to say about that. The first is that you're going to spend about 70,000 hours of your life working. And so even though the bumper sticker wisdom says that no one lies on their deathbed saying, I wish I'd spent another day at the office, the fact is that most of us look back on our lives thinking that what we accomplished in our career is something that was an important part of who we were. And so if you feel like this isn't going to be where you want to be, that's the time to make a change. And in fact, this is the second piece. The research that's been done on regret shows overwhelmingly that when you ask older people what they regret, it's not the dumb things they did in their lives, it's the things they didn't do that they regret most. And so each of us, when we're still at an age to be able to affect that trajectory, should project ourselves to the end of our lives and ask, are there things we will regret not having done? And if some of those are career related, maybe it's time to make a shift in what you're doing before it's too late.
Absolutely. Real words of wisdom there. And that's actually connected to my next question, which is about mentorship. One of the things that you say, instead of a single mentor, you recommend finding a mentor team to help individuals grow their career. Why is that?
Well, there's several reasons for it. The first is, of course, most firms use mentoring in a horrible way. You get hired and they assign you a mentor. You go out for lunch or coffee, you have a wonderful conversation, and you never speak again because the mentor really doesn't have anything that you need, and so there just isn't the kind of depth to that relationship that's needed. What you need most, though, are people who can help you to advance in what you're trying to accomplish, which takes a little bit of time for you to figure out. And often there isn't a single person who has all of those characteristics. So, for example, you need a superstar in your life, somebody who has the kind of career you want, so that you can just listen to how they got to where they are and just glean little tidbits about ways that they navigated key choice points. But those people aren't necessarily going to have the time to coach you through some of the difficult things that you're going to do. So you not only need people who can share their experience, you need people who can serve as coaches. And a good coach is somebody who doesn't give you the answer. They help you to work through that answer so that the next time you're in the same situation, you can find it. You also need people who can help you to navigate your organization. Every organization has hidden people that you should know or should avoid, and you need somebody who can help you to work your way through that maze. And so there's a variety of different people who are out there that you need to engage with, and don't feel like I need to go to a mentor, but instead find a group of people. And some of those people may actually be younger than you. So as you advance in your career, you might find that there are new technologies like Instagram or other social media that you don't use as effectively as you could, at which point maybe you should reach out to some of the newer people who seem to be really savvy about that and ask them how to do it. And if you're in a leadership role and you do this kind of reverse mentoring, actually that has a benefit on the organization, because one of the things it does is to communicate very effectively that everyone in the organization should be reaching out to others who have something they need and learning from them, which ultimately strengthens the whole firm.
Absolutely. And that gets back to what you were talking about earlier, and learning orientation and exhibiting that, particularly during an interview. Most managers, when they are interviewing for a position on their team, whether they articulate it or not, are looking for somebody who has a strong learning orientation. And having multiple mentors absolutely gets right to that point. Yeah. Finally, what about on-the-job performance? There's always a lot of attention paid to managing versus leading. How does applying cognitive science apply to this conversation?
Yeah, so, the fascinating thing is there are a million definitions of management versus leadership, what's going on here. But I think what most of us need to recognize is that in leadership roles, we often are asked to think strategically. And so we're asked to envision what the future could be. The thing about envisioning the future is that it's strongly determined by what you know already. We know from studies, for example, that if you just take the average person and ask them to draw an alien creature that doesn't exist, this is research that got done by Tom Ward and his colleagues, what you find is that the creatures that they draw still are bilaterally symmetric. They've got limbs on both sides and sensory organs on both sides. They might have 6 eyes rather than 2, but they still more or less resemble what you've encountered before. And your ability to navigate new situations strategically has that same anchor in your past experience. And so one of the things we need to learn about real leadership, strategic leadership, is that we have to open ourselves up to new experiences in order to recognize the various ways that new situations may differ from previous ones. But we also need to recognize that we can't denigrate management in order to be a leader, because managers are people who have to be very operational in their thinking. And the best leaders are able to shuttle back and forth between establishing a vision for the future, but also recognizing the importance of giving very clear instructions operationally about how to carry out that goal. And those leaders who are able to go back and forth between those things and to really engage both strategically and tactically bring to the table something that enables organizations, I think, to function quite well.
That's a great way to articulate management versus leadership and that vision versus operationalizing various activities that a lot of people really just don't think about. So we're moving towards the end of our program, and I'd like to switch gears for a bit and ask you about your own personal reading lists. What are you currently reading? What book or books have you been most inspired by?
So I love to read broadly. And one of the books that I read this summer that I absolutely loved is a book called Scale by Jeffrey West. And he's a complexity scientist. He's a physicist at the Center for Complex Systems in New Mexico. And he got interested in death, actually, and wanted to know, why do critters die, and found some very interesting mathematical relationships between creatures that he then applied not just to biology, but also to cities and to companies. It's a fascinating read and one that I highly recommend to people. I'm also a big believer, though, in fiction, because I was the founding director of a program called the Human Dimensions of Organizations that tries to teach people in business, government, nonprofits, and the military about people. And we use all the liberal arts to do that, not just the social sciences and the behavioral sciences, but also the humanities. And literature plays a big role in that. And one of the things that literature does is enables you to put yourself in someone else's situation and often to learn from that. And so this year, probably my favorite novel that I've read is a book called There, which is a story about the Native American community in Oakland. Without giving anything away, the book is a fascinating slow-motion train wreck that I absolutely loved cover to cover, and it has real insights into the lives of people who are very different from ourselves, that are not just, it's not just interesting because of the story itself, which is riveting, but also it helps us to see some of the mindsets that we get into that sometimes limit our activities and cause us to engage in some of those same slow motion train wrecks.
Wow. Thank you for that. Put those on my list. Well, this has truly been an intriguing discussion, Art. Thank you for joining us and lending your insights.
Thanks, Jennifer. It's great to be here.
And thank you to our listeners. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of Art's book, Bring Your Brain to Work, it is available at all major book retailers, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our off-the-shelf book discussion podcast series, or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at www.conference-board.org/podcasts. This is Jennifer Tarlow from the Conference Board. Thank you for joining us.